All right, so sitting with Fred Scherrer from the Scherrer Winery in November of 2025. Missed the chance to have you here in person because of some family illness, but couple of questions specifically for some events that we're doing now. Starting right off and jumping into the middle of it, we're doing the Sasha 2016 and 2017 next Syrah tonight at Bar Perizet, and Matt Sussman, the owner, has a bottle of 2005 Bliss Vineyard Syrah.
Nice.
So my first question is, if you're pouring this tableside, or you're pouring the two of those, tell me about those two wines. Yeah, let's start with that. Tell me about those two wines, how they compare, how the vineyards compare, and then we can talk vineyards next.
Yeah, well, first of all, aside from the vineyards, they're, 10 years apart from each other and 10 years from current. So we got one that's 10 years in, essentially, and that's 20 years in. The vineyards are very, very different. Sasha's not from a specific vineyard, actually. It's typically from Calypso or parts of Calypso and parts of Lolita that Martinelli's own. But Sasha's more of a stylistic statement than a vineyard origin thing. It tends to come from a little bit richer soils, things that might be more appropriate for growing rosé. But under the right circumstances, the right kind of vintage, parts of those blocks would actually make a really nice red wine. So when we harvest it essentially at or close to rosé ripeness levels and divert some of those grapes, the parts where the grapes seem a little riper, berries are a little smaller, we'll make some red wine out of that. And it's just the prettier side of Syrah, a little more herbal, red fruited sort of side, which is what the Sasha is. And Bliss Vineyard, Don Bliss and I were very good friends in the 90s, and he wanted to plant a vineyard, mostly Pinot Noir, but we both love Syrah and we both love Rosé. And there's this one section that's kind of in a waterlogged area or potentially, flooding part of his vineyard. And he said, let's put Syrah there, just for the hell of it. And I said, well, yeah, if it doesn't make it for red, we'll make some rosé. And he was able to get two different clones from John Caldwell, allegedly 300 and 174, I think is what they were.
Sorry,
Um,
who is John Caldwell?
he's a viticulturist in Napa Valley who was kind of on the vanguard of bringing in and teaching people about different rootstocks and also some clones of some interesting things, Pinot Noir and Cabernet and other stuff. So he was, pretty early in the learning curve on this stuff in the early '90s. So he was kind of integral to a lot of the learning that was going on. I actually bought a bunch of rootstock sticks from him in '91 or '92, I think it was, and it was like interviewing for a job before he would sell me these cuttings. He wanted to know everything about me, what I was going to do with it, so on and so forth. We spent half a day talking about this before he, decided that he'd sell me some of these things. And it was pretty interesting. The file's still in our house, but it's been kind of neglected. Anyway, so we got these two clones of Syrah from Caldwell, and this once they were in, the descriptions were the opposite of what they appeared for the two clones. And one was a larger berry with sort of a oval shape, and the other one was smaller berries and round. And the description of those Ontog clones, it was as though they swapped them, So Don Bliss, being a scientist, he was a fleet surgeon of the Pacific Fleet when he retired in '92, a doctor of internal medicine, super smart guy. He's like, you know what? I don't believe this. Do you? And I said, no, I don't believe it either. He says, well, we'll just call them large berry and small berry. And now we know which one we're talking about. So we're not, perpetuating a mistake or a myth or a misnomer. And it turns out the small berry was lovely. It had more blueberry kind of notes to it. And on its own, it was superior to the large berry. However, when you combine them, the wine was better than just the small berry. And we thought that was fascinating. It was just a much more complete wine and much more compelling. So we were glad that we did both of those. But initially, we vinified them separately so we could understand them. And then later on, we realized that we'll just co-ferment them if they're ripe at the same time and get it over with. So
How
that's what
many
we did.
years did it take to, how many years did it take to figure that out? Was it obvious pretty soon?
It was, but we did a couple years. '03 was I'm sorry, '02 was the first vintage, pretty much baby vines. But we realized that, that doesn't tell you much. We got a taste of it. By '03, we go, okay, this is what's going on here. So then in '04 and '05, we were co-fermenting. And we maybe leave a couple of them separate, but then co-ferment some of it, so we could see the benefit of actually co-fermenting somewhat diverse elements. And we knew what the proportions were, so then we could take the other two and vinified separately and do a blend of those and see if the co-fermentation was actually a plus. And it appeared to be a very good plus. And part of the reason I think that is, it's maybe not intrinsic to co-fermenting when you have two different clones of something that are a little bit different than each other, as opposed to like Viognier and Syrah or something like that. But all of the winemaking choices are wedded to the fact that you've already got the blend, right? You've got the two things together. So your choice of when to devat and then how to press and when to quit pressing and or collecting press wine is all integral to that. When you have the separate lots, so your choices are integral to each of those in isolation, and you're not looking at that whole. And I found this with making Huntsman, the Syrah Grenache blend that I do. It's when I'm learning about new sites, I'll want to keep them separately, but sometimes I'll want to co-ferment part of it as well. And what I found is, particularly with the Grenache and Syrah, this is a tangent, but with Syrah and Grenache that are so diverse in how they react to pressing, um, that it's like a David Bowie concert. It starts off kind of masculine, and then it makes this move feminine kind of here, and it's very interesting. And then it goes back a little masculine again at a certain point, because those carbonic berries from the Grenache become a very large part of the press fractions once you begin to put a little bit more pressure on them. So it's not like you're starting with homogeneous material. So anyway, back to the co-fermentation. I think a lot of that is that those winemaking choices, the length of maceration and the pressing choices are all integral to what that whole is. So you're already marching along with a unit, and I think that's a big benefit to that.
Where is the Bliss Vineyard?
It is right on the Laguna de Santa Rosa near Linmar Winery. It's pretty much at parts of it will flood when we get a lot of rainfall. So it's on these Goldridge fine sandy loams, but it's at a relatively low elevation, then it slopes up gradually to a little higher elevation. Linmar bought the property in 90 or in 2004. And I think they make a Bliss block Pinot Noir. They pulled out the Syrah because I guess they were not interested in Syrah. I told them I'd buy it, but they wanted to be simpler, which is fine.
Yeah.
That's their choice. But I really miss that vineyard because it's got some beautiful characters to it, even though it's in an unlikely spot.
Is is that technically Green Valley?
No, Green Valley is just a little bit to the west. So
Okay.
this is, I guess you would call it Laguna Hills neighborhood. But the Green Valley AVA begins at Highway 116, which is kind of at the top of the ridge and then runs to the west, up into
Okay.
the hills.
And so your last vintage was '05.
Let's see. Yes, '05 was my last vintage.
Okay. Okay. Have you had that wine anytime in the last?
I had it a year ago, and I pulled, I, I dug out a library for our library offering coming up on Saturday, and I haven't done shopping for us, but I was pulling things that I wanted to release and sell, and I have an alleged idea of supposed inventory of items. And so I know when something's pretty rare, or I think I know when something's really rare. So then I can decide when I want to fully deplete it. But I'm jonesing it that Bliss Syrah because we pulled a bottle last year and it was gorgeous. It's getting it's got a couple decades in the bottle, so it's got some bottle bouquet, but it still has these wonderful perfumes that are really stable. It's not esters and temporary spell. It's the real stuff.
Hmm. So then 10 years later, you've
Mm.
got Sasha, maybe 11. Well, Sasha comes on. What
Hmm.
we're in this comparison, we're looking at something that is 2016. Um, Over that decade with Syrah, did your winemaking change for that grape?
Everything changes a little bit. The time in barrel is a lot longer now than it was. I think. I racked that Bliss Syrah once in its élevage, and I'm racking things no, not at all, and leaving them longer. So those are the major differences. I think all the other stuff is pretty similar. The sensibilities and aesthetics are pretty similar as far as like pressing and when to devat, et cetera.
Hmm. And you said Calypso. Calypso is now off the table as well, right?
Essentially, he pulled out the major portion of the vineyard that he was selling to me, and he
Yeah.
kept enough for himself to do a barrel of home wine, a little Pinot Noir, half barrel of Pinot, and maybe a barrel of some Syrah and some Rosé. He has opened the door saying that, he and his family can't drink that much wine, and he doesn't have that many friends. So um, he's put the offer on the table in the right kind of vintage. If he was to take a year off, would I take the fruit? And I said, absolutely. Because I know he's kept the most profound little parts in the dribs and drabs of the different clones that we've worked for 15 years to understand somewhat how they work together. So I would take it in a heartbeat. I'd have probably one barrel.
Yeah. Cool. Um, so we're 10 years apart, and then we're different, obviously, in terms of origin for Sasha with the two
Yeah.
blends. Um, What do you, if you have your druthers, what types of things do you think about pairing with Syrah from Sonoma? And then particularly, is that going to be any different from Syrah that you might have from another part of the world as you studied Syrah to try to figure out?
Yeah.
Um,
Syrah really has a lot of diversity in its expression based on where it's grown, you got the Aussie Shirazes, the whole gamut of them, right? You've got the cheap seats, and then you've got some really profound wines. You've got this beautiful stuff in the Northern Rhone. Um, and different, even the Southern Rhone has some pretty interesting Syrahs, that also that Cuvée Syrah. I've still probably got half a case of that from 1988, which is probably an immortal wine. But and in Sonoma County, Sonoma County is super diverse, not only in soils but in climates. So we've got, I've worked with some Syrah from Coal Creek Vineyard up in pretty close to our place in Alexander Valley. It's actually officially it's both Chalk Hill AVA and Russian River Valley AVA, but it's not the warmer corner of that, and it expresses itself. Granted, they're a little different clones, but expresses itself with a little more dark fruits and meatiness to it, and a little bit of savory. Versus at Calypso, the small berry stuff just had this gorgeous blueberry fruit thing to it, this kind of purity um, and even a kind of a lightness to it, depending on which soil it was. So it's just really diverse in Sonoma County. I love it. That's why one reason Sasha came about. It's like, oh, this will make a really nice, pretty Syrah, and then we've got other things that are more profound. Um, so it's very sensitive to where it's grown.
is Sasha basically just an excuse to go play and explore that?
Oh, I don't need excuses as an explorer. I just need to sell it, so I got to give it a name.
Gotcha. Yep. Yeah. Um, in another comparison piece, looking prompted because we did the Chardonnay last night, the 2014 Helfer, which I
Mhm.
still think, even then, 8 years on, I still taste the influence of my handling of the truck at the '06 harvest. I still think it's improved and
It
benefiting
echoes
that vineyard.
it
Oh,
echoes well beyond your absence.
it it's really impressive. Those four vines that I picked in 3.5 hours really were singing, I think.
Yeah,
Um,
they
so
miss you.
no, they don't. Nor does the picking crew that was very annoyed at my my slow and inefficient efforts. Um, so you've got Helfer, which is Russian River Syrah, and you have the Alexander Valley Scherrer Vineyard Syrah. In
Mhm.
broad strokes, tell me about your Chardonnay program and why you have two.
I have two because they come from different sites. We just happen to have Chardonnay at our place, and I started working with that in '97. Um, and um, I initially thought I would do a non-malolactic kind of thing to it, but I said, I'm learning about this stuff. Let's just do the full thing with it. Let's let it go through mallow and barrel ferment in some newer and older barrels, and it was very successful. What's interesting about that site is that due to a viral disease that the plants have, it has very high acidity and doesn't make sugar very quickly. So if it was clean plant material, it probably wouldn't be nearly as good. But because it's diseased, everything is in sync. You know, the flavors and the chemistry, the whole balance of the thing really works out. Unfortunately, at this stage, these vines are 35 years old. We only get about a ton to a ton and a half per acre. You know, that's like 15 to 22 hectoliters per hectare. Um, Part of it is that we have some missing vines and some disease things that we're working on, rebuilding the plants, but the yield is not really big. Helfer, on the other hand, is it's a completely different plant material. It is a couple of Dijon clones in a small way, because this was planted in the early 90s when everybody was focused on Dijon clones and all the new stuff that, people like John Caldwell were marketing and talking about. And Steve Kistler was even doing some of that, experimenting with it. However, Steve, who's pretty much right across the road from the Helper Vineyard, he's really was focused on this old Wente material that he and Larry Hyde would select out of each other's latest plantings and looking for plants that made good looking fruit, good tasting fruit that seemed healthy. So that each iteration of their plantings was more of a fine tuning of um, that collection of stuff. So Don Helfer, I was at Dalinger at the time when Don was planting this, and he came and bugged us about Dijon clones and all that stuff. I said, dude, I'm just reading about it. You probably know more than I do because you probably read another chapter than me. So I can't give you anything. I know he did the same thing to Steve Kistler, and Kistler told him, look, this is what I'm experimenting. I don't know anything either yet. And, but if you're going to plant this vineyard here, this is what I use. He gave him a big bundle of that old Wente budwood, and he said, just go away. Okay, plant the stuff and leave me alone. So Don did that, and he planted on a low vigor rootstock, which was one of the first ones in our area planted to 3309, and or lower vigor rootstock on a really close planting spacing. It was 43 inches by 43 inches. It's a really unusual spacing, and I think the reason is because he's an engineer. He bought the rootstocks. He knew how many square feet he had to plant, and he did the math and divided it up, and then just planted them there. And he headed them very low to the ground. Again, he was looking at what was supposedly going to give the highest quality stuff. But this is a person with no viticultural background. But just going to what he considers some of the top people to find out what they'd recommend. And so he did everything that he thought made sense, and it worked out pretty good. Those vines they're getting up there in age. Uh, so I've been working with that vineyard since the '98 vintage. It was mostly
What
Pinot
is
and a
that?
little.
What do they yield? Because you mentioned it was so low at the Scherrer Vineyard. What is the comparison yield for Helfer?
It's almost twice as much. So he gets about 2 tons per acre, and it's a 1 acre vineyard. So it's about 2 tons. Sometimes we only get a ton and a half. Um, I think it was our 25th year together. He and his childhood friend, who was a partner in the vineyard, and as far as the expense of the budwood, they decided to give me the fruit that year as a thank you. And he was laughing because we'd had frost that year and it was a tiny crop. So, um, so I think I got 2 barrels total. I think when I would normally would get 4, 5 or so. Anyway, so the yields aren't that high. We used to um, get a little bit better yields, but I think they're in equilibrium with their environment. They make some pretty good stuff. They were starting to decline a little bit. I hooked him up with a consultant who gave him some advice on fertilizing the vines organically a little bit. He's got a little weaker area there that give a little something back to them to get the vigor back to just an appropriate level, and it really worked. So I think Don's really invested a lot in this, and he's getting up there in age too. He's in his mid 70s as his Otis Holt of Calypso. So these guys they still got the energy to do it, and they're still interested in moving forward and learning.
How does Helfer compare to the Scherrer Vineyard in sort of side by side tastings?
The Scherrer is always leaner. It seems to have brighter acidity, not quite as much body to it, aside from any alcohol or glycerol levels that the wines may end up at. But the Scherrer just seems to have a little lower pH and a little brighter acidity in any given vintage, which is the opposite of what people would think given the areas. But again, I think the plant material, the health of the plant material is a huge factor there. It overrides what you would expect otherwise. If we had exactly the same plant material in both places, it would probably follow the relative expectations.
Yeah, the 14 having it last night, and I know you said you're opening one up for the library. Just terrifically, like it's got a lot of density on the mid palate at first, and then just
Mhm.
lightens up and really I had a number of people giving me the I don't like Chardonnay, but this is really good line, which is one we hear a lot when people have had
Yeah.
Chardonnay that's maybe not well made. But in this case specifically, the age was surprising and sold actually one couple bought 4 bottles off of it, which not inexpensive, saying this is the is that saying like this is a Chardonnay to have in the house that you can use that is going to be um, one to share when you have people over who say they like Chardonnay, but you want to drink something too, and they're like, "Oh yeah, that's good. This would be good to have." And it was a nice little moment of them just tasting the wine and really
Nice.
realizing that there's a lot in the glass. So
Yeah. Well, that's cool. These things. Don Helfer um, likes them quite a bit older. He's drinking them prior to 2010. I mean, every once in a while he'll open something younger, and it's God, that taste actually tasted pretty good. At such a young age. So yeah, it's pretty funny. But
yeah.
some of these older vintages are quite something. Yeah.
And then just for the context of tonight, we are doing Old Mature Vine Zin and Zinfandel. And I just thought it would be interesting. Again, the side by side. Don't think I've asked you about that in a while, but talking about in the Zin program, the selection process, and you talked about co-fermenting Syrah and learning from the different parcels, and I know how carefully you blend those. Talk to me a little bit about the different parcels of the vineyard, the old vines, the oldest vines, the youngest vines, the Alicante Bouschet wines. Tell me a little bit about the Zin history.
Well, the oldest vineyard is about 3.34 acres, give or take. And it has a few non-Zinfandel vines in it. Not very many. It's way less than 1%. There's some Alicante Boucher vines. There's a few Petit Boucher vines that look like Petit Syrah, but they have red juice like Alicante Boucher. There's a few Petit Syrah vines. In the old vineyard, there's no Carignan vines, which is interesting. But it's essentially pure Zinfandel. It was planted originally in 1912, and then some replants were put in there. That's where the other varieties came in. Is when my grandfather was planting something else, and you got some spaces in your vineyard. You got the plant, you got the hole, you fill the hole. Um, so um, it's unirrigated, 8 by 8 foot planting, which is what the team of horses could get through. It's what they planted things, either 7 foot by 7 foot or 8 foot by 8 foot. And I guess if you had one horse, you planted 7 by 7. If you had two, you planted them 8 by 8. But so we have mostly old vines there. There's some that are younger, a bit younger. And it's been a while since we planted anything in there. So next time we get some, um, bench dormant benchcraft pines, we'll go ahead and fill in the blanks there. Hopefully, it'll be a wet winter because we have no way to really irrigate them to help those little baby vines get out there and compete, with everybody else. Um, the mature vines, they vary from the early 70s to 82. What the main block that I used was planted in 77. And we don't know what clones they are. We probably should because, we bought the mature vines as dormant bench crafts for the most part from a nursery. And we should know what the clones were, but we were ignorant about it. We didn't really worry. We figured Zinfandel, right? And it was Zinfandel on St. George. We have another block on this hilltop that I work with. It's sometimes I bottle separately, um, and that is budwood that came from the Teldeschi vineyard um, because we planted just the rootstocks and then had Frank Teldeschi came in and grafted them. I think it was like in 73 or 74, grafted those. So we have a few different, potential clones of Zinfandel out there. The soils are really different. We have it's a Bositas gravelly clay loam. For the most part, we have a little bits of
Tell me the
cloud.
name. Sorry, that cut out. The name of the
Yeah,
gravelly clay loam, Positas.
Positas,
Okay.
Positas. That's the current uh, nomenclature. I think it was in the teens. There was a um, soil survey done. They called it corning gravelly loam, but this is the current, I guess, name, right? Um, and they did, they kind of half-ass mapped them. But then we've got the hill is actually on a different soil that I think they call Clough, Clough. It has very little clay in it. It's I wouldn't say it's moon dust, but it's this um, breaks into little tiny clumps. It doesn't get dusty, but it's like a totally fracturable rock that um, doesn't get into tiny little particles, but um, it drains well. It's a, it's a different animal. Um, the mature vines from 77 of the old mature vines, that's on the same kind of soil as the old vines, um, not too far from each other. And just this year, because we used to sell our excess fruit to Gallo, or at least the areas that were beyond what I could use. This season, they came to us and said that they weren't going to be buying fruit. So fortunately, we found a buyer for most all of it. But I took a larger area. I took some other spots I hadn't had for years, and it's got a little different character to it as well. It's like, oh, geez. So we're playing around with stuff. It's opened the door to some new things, and um, the yields aren't that huge. The old vines, I think this last year were 1 and 6/10, 1 and 2/3 ton per acre, 1.5. If we're lucky, we can get two. Um, the mature
So
vines are two, two and a
more than the
half.
Chardonnay.
Yeah, the Chardonnay is hideously low.
Yeah.
Old vines in is more what you'd expect, and the mature vines is about what you'd expect from vines that age. I'd like to get 3 tons per acre on them if we have if we have a full stand. Um, but there's still some missing vines and some disease things that will be that we're regrowing and rebuilding. But 2.5 ton, 2.25, 2.5 tons per acre seems to be what we get. So that's 35 hectoliters per hectare. So that's all. But in Burgundy, right, to be a Grand Cru, it's got to be under 35 hectoliters per hectare.
I was thinking that, yeah, exactly that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, so all the different pieces and parcels, where do you, well, first just on the planting part, tell me what do you remember about actually planting with your dad out there and when you planted the mature vines?
Yeah, well, there were different blocks at different times. We had prune orchards out there in all of where the mature vines are. So um, then they were like 2 to 3 acre blocks. So every couple of years, we would remove one of those blocks of orchard, rip it, um, pick up rocks, disc it, pick up rocks, disc it again, pick up rocks. And so that was my job, is picking up rocks on hot days, hot afternoons. And then when we planted, I remember the mature vines. I'd actually gone out. It was the day after my junior prom, and I was a little hungover and had been out pretty late. Didn't take much to get me hurt in those days. And I remember planning that stuff, and I was hurting, but you got to show up and do the stuff. So we had a nice little system for that. Dig a hole, put the plant, pretty good sized hole, put the plant in. My grandfather, he was still alive in those days, and he would prune the roots back so that they wouldn't wrap around each other when they got into the hole. That's something that would be called J rooting. And a lot of vineyards that got planted quickly, they would just leave all the roots in there, jam it into the hole, and the roots would girdle themselves. So you get 10 years on a vine, and now the vines are dying, or some of them would be dying. So he said, you put your hand around there, you cut everything else off, you make sure that they're facing outward. You put it down in the hole, put some dirt in there, a little bit of water, and then you pull up on it so the roots are kind of pointed downward, and that way everything is ready to go out. And so that's what we did to it, and it's about every 2 or 3 years we plant another 2 or 3 acres because for the first couple of years, it's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, just training them up, tying them. Um, we would use milk cartons to protect them from rabbits. We had a lot of rabbits around in those days, and They would just they loved eating grapevines.
What was the dynamic between your grandfather and your dad at that point?
Oh, a very quiet acceptance. They worked together, and my grandfather's a very quiet guy, very even tempered, um, just very very gentle and soft spoken. He was actually kind of a veterinarian in their area, an unofficial veterinarian. People would bring if their horse wasn't, not in those days, but long, long, long ago when horses were your transportation, neighbors would bring a horse and leave it with him for a week or so, and he would kind of observe them and check them out, kind of see what's going on with the horse, and what maybe they were feeding him, or they could give him some sort of a remedy of some sort. But he had a very quiet way about himself, a
Mhm.
very, I think, profound understanding of things. I remember when he
When
would say,
sorry, go ahead.
"Oh, when he would start a phrase with years ago, I knew it was time to sit down and listen."
Um, when the decision was made to replant those, was that his decision? Was that your dad's decision at that point?
It was his decision because it was his property, and it broke his heart because he loved those trees. They were fantastically profitable and successful for the most of the time that those trees were in. But then the market collapsed, and there was other areas that had different varieties that were inferior, but they could farm them more efficiently. And again, the product wasn't the same, but it didn't matter because the processors didn't seem to care. Things got really moved toward a least common denominator. So anyway, he knew that it was time to change over, and the grapes were making more sense. The economics were making sense. So he was on board, and that was his idea to do it. My dad had the energy to throw himself at it.
And then you guys, that part of the vineyard, you did the Zin in the through the 70s and then planted the cab early 80s, right?
Yeah, it was 89 was the year that my dad planted the Cabernet. He took out part of it was an old prune orchard that had been removed several years prior and laid fallow. And then part of it was an old Petite Syrah vineyard with a little bit of Zinfandel in it that was also pulled out. And I wanted Dad to keep that because I was hoping to start my own brand, making some stuff from the old vines. I wanted to work with Pete Syrah, just like I did when I was a teenager, and make blends and things like that. But he impressed me that that's not a wise farming choice because the yields were tiny. They weren't worth that much. They didn't always make a super successful vintage. The Petite Sirah were pretty fragile to rain or to excessive heat. Again, the yields were low and um, they weren't worth very much. But Cabernet was up and coming. So he said that's what he's going to do. And it turns out that was a great choice. I told him that after the first vintage. Oh my God, that was such a good choice because the yields were good. They're easy to grow and it makes fantastic wine.
Were those Petite Sirah vines as old as do they date back to the same
They were
1920?
1911.
Yeah.
And I think the Zin was 1910. There was a small block of Zin and the rest of it was Petit Syrah. So
Hmm.
10, 11, and 12, my grandfather planted.
Yeah. Um, Interesting. Yeah, the that choice of the cab and seeing that coming, that sounds like it's easy to look back now and just assume that California Cabernet has always been California Cabernet. And I think it's interesting to talk and just remember how untrue that is in terms of it being the grape of California.
Yeah. But Robert Young was a cohort of my dad's. They grew up together, and Bob said, "Yeah, you think of plant some?" He's like, "Well, the Cabernet seems to be good." He had a clone, it's probably clone 7 at that time. That's what they would have had because he gave my dad the Budwood. He says it seems clean, it's easy to grow. The winemakers seem to like it, so it seems like a good choice, and it was. It's a great match to the soil. If we planted more cab, I kind of wondering what else we would do. Do more of the same or a little bit of some other things to learn. But that stuff is so successful there, it'd be difficult to not put some more in. Especially to compare with vine age. Have similar young vines comparing with the young vines.
So You have evolved with the Cabernet, moving from early days of relatively traditional winemaking to now the almost 4 years in barrel, basically untouched, if I understand everything correctly.
Yeah.
Tell me about that evolution. Tell me about why you've gone and right now how you are making it. We're tasting 2018 now. Are you still using some of the same techniques as you did in 18?
Very, very similar. Yeah. I'd have to look back at the record to see when I followed 18, but pretty damn close to 4 years, three and a half, 4 years, somewhere in there without racking. I quit racking the cab and I have to think about what vintage that was, probably 2014 or 15. I have to look back at the records. That's about when I quit doing that. What made me start wondering about this was the 97 vintage. I made that while I was at Dalinger, and then I moved into this facility. So, outfitted the place with equipment and all that kind of stuff. Well, so I moved all the barrels over here, but I'd ordered a barrel rinser and kind of a high tech, low water use, very, very efficient, which is similar technology that I use today. And it was delayed in getting delivered. So I couldn't rack on the schedule that I thought I was going to rack on because I didn't have the tool to clean the barrels. So it sat there. And then I'm tasting the wine. I'm going, you know what? A few more months on lease, this didn't hurt it at all. I think I liked it, you know? So I start wondering, why in the hell do I do what I do when I do? So everything has to be for a purpose. It needs to be reasoned, and sometimes we need something to happen that makes us stop for a minute to rethink that, right? Instead of just automatically go on and do this stuff. So I did some experiments with leaving some things or withholding racking. I did it with the rosé as well. I thought, okay, I'll rack the rosé, after it's kind of settled for a couple of months, get most of the lees out of it, and then that way it's easier to get a clean racking to the bottling tank. But I left a couple, didn't rack it. And my God, the difference was huge, And I said, "Oh, I'm not going to do this again. I'm going to leave it on the lees until the last damn minute because they really liked it, just even in those few months." And we weren't even getting, huge amounts of excretion of manoproteins or even autolysis or anything like that. It's just a little bit more time on those lees was really good. So I have
When
a great
you
fun.
so you've said very clearly that, man, it was so good. What was the wine doing that made it so much better? How did it taste different with more time on the lees?
It was more seamless. There wasn't like any, little jagged edges. It was just a lot more seamless and graceful and just would flow, as opposed to having static, on an audio signal or something. It was just this beautiful tones. So I said, "Oh yeah, yeah, this is a good thing." So then that told me how to rack to my bottling tank. I'm going to have to go a lot further off the bottom, and not all the wine's going to go. The old idea was, you rack it, take a little bit of the solids, but then that'll stick to the barrel. The next time you rack it, you have a lot less solids. So after several rackings, um, you've got a clean wine. But you can get a clean wine if you go right off of those initial leads. You just have to go a little bit higher, and maybe not have a hell of a lot of leads, if you have control over that. Save with your reds, when you're going to go to barrel. If you go to barrel right away, you have a lot of leaves, you have a lot of vegetable material, right? Plant material that is a little bit heavier. So that stuff will settle out in the tank, and then your microbes tend to settle out a lot slower. And so yeast, and you've got bacteria in there, but mostly yeast, they're going to be hanging out. And those actually are very positive to have in the leaves. That's the most positive part. So you settle it long enough to get the vegetable material out, the stuff that'll rot or go funky, and keep the stuff that you actually want to have for the long term. So with the cabs, I go with a little cleaner racking to tank. I give it an extra day or so in tank. Whereas with the Zins and Pinot, I just put them to barrel the next day mostly, unless it's a really full tank. If it's a larger lot and it's got a long ways for the stuff to fall too, I might fall through. I might wait an extra day and let that stuff fall a little more thoroughly. So just thinking about, I don't measure the solids, but I'm thinking about what's coming out. And then I look at, the tank's bottoms are sloped. So I look at how how cleanly things come off. How good of a pack did I get of those things that I don't want so much.
Last question, just in thinking about stuff we're doing this week. Showing the rosé at the Oakville. Had a glass of it at lunch the other day with them. And I was, as I often am, but was just really struck by how vinous it is and how much more there is to your rosé than I think most people would expect, to where um yeah, I was just struck by how vinous and how easy to drink it is. Um, Give me a little bit of a view on the rosé. Of you have the two rosés, the two programs, and we're just getting the 24 here, so we'll be younger than we've been for a while on the rosé. Um, where are you? Walk me through. Where are you at? How are you making it? Have you changed anything in the last period with the rosé?
I started doing rosé by bleeding a little bit of juice out of my red fermenters, and you got to fiddle with the chemistry a little bit because the red stuff picked for red is a little riper and lower acidity, so it makes some adjustments to get the composition appropriate. And those were pretty good. And I remember Michael Wild at Beowulf Restaurant in Oakland. Uh, he he loved the rosé, and he would say, even in those days, and he'd say, this is real wine. You know, because man, this is just real wine. And but over the years, let's say about 2009, I started direct pressing things and adding that into the whole thing. And oh my God, this is the way to do it. So I quit bleeding anything. I figured, why am I robbing some of my precious reds just to make a little rosé? Well, just there's parts of vineyards that are Destiny's rosé. It's look for more vigorous places that you can hang a bigger crop because you don't have to ripen it all the way to make all the tissues to make for a red wine. You just need to get the juice to a really flavorful spot, and that's it. And so then you don't have to fiddle with things. Pick it at the right time, press it just enough, and let it roll. So I played around with varieties, combinations thereof. I settled into Syrah and Grenache, or Grenache and Syrah is a really great thing. And then in 2020, because of the fires and smoke affected a couple of sites I work with, I lost most of the Syrah that I'd got was going to have. So I thought, well, I need to have something to balance that Grenache somewhat. So I thought maybe some of our Zinfandel picked at the right time will affect that, and it didn't. It was more like the Grenache than it was like Syrah. A little different perfumes, but and then I found a little bit of Syrah that um, a tiny bit. So I treaded on it, let it stew overnight on the skins to get a little bit more of the Syrah stuff out of it. Almost like concentrated a little bit, so it would go a little further, and that worked out great. But then I realized that adding the Zinfandel brought this hibiscus note that I really liked, and it wasn't in the Zin by itself, wasn't in anything else. But when I added the Zin to the blend, this hibiscus thing came out. So that became part of the new recipe, is having some of our Zinfandel in there as well. Uh, and this last year, I took Zinfandel from because we had excess fruit. It wasn't sold. I drew from another area that I'd not drawn from before. And my God, I made a fantastic rosé. I was telling Judy, hey, maybe I'll get more of this next year and we'll just make a Zinfandel rosé too. As she rolls her eyes, right? And but it's gorgeous on its own. And interestingly, I typically like to inoculate my rosé with a commercial yeast that is just really clean and beautiful, without too much odd wild complexities, non-fruit complexities. But the Zinfandel this year started fermenting on its own. So I said, okay, fine, that's what you're going to do. But it's fantastic. It doesn't have any of the negative parts that I've often associated with an indigenous rosé fermentation here. So
Hmm.
so it's
That's
evolving
the
a little
that's the
bit.
20 that's the 24.
That's the 2015. 24 has
2025.
Zinfandel in it.
Sorry.
or
Yeah. Okay.
the 25. Yeah, this just
25.
this
Yeah.
last year. It's
Yep.
awesome, just by itself. It's like, wow.
Hmm.
So I play around with blending trials to see what the best combination is, and that's why I often have two rosés, because the combination of everything that I have isn't necessarily the best. I try to get what I need that's probably all going to go together, but I have to be honest about whether that's the best rosé that I can make. So withholding a barrel or two or three of some things, if I can sculpt it in the right direction, then that's what we'll do. That's why I've had several different cuvées. I usually would have excess Syrah, and now I don't. And in 23, I had excess Grenache, and it was awesome on its own. Um, so we did some of it separately, And this year, I'm thinking, okay, well, the door's open to doing whatever, So we'll have our main blended rosé and possibly something else.
Cool. I look forward to tasting that Zin-based Grenache, but I'm looking forward to the 24. I haven't had that. We'll get it out to them here
24 is
shortly.
gorgeous. The 23 is showing just perfect for me. Our rosé's got such energy to it that it really does need a little bit of time. We had the 21 in the market in Hawaii when I was there last year. That's what we were
Yeah.
doing at the wine dinners and stuff I did, and it's gorgeous. And then people go, what year is this? That's supposed to be dead. And I go, well, it's not dead. So, enjoy it. 22 is really nice. 23 is, well, 22 and 23 are in the sweet spot for me, and I think when you get a couple years on a rosé, it seems to show a little more richness. That edginess is calmed down a little bit, so it would go with more with different kind of foods, stuff that you would want a little bit gentler wine to go with.
Yeah. How do you see people selling your rosé when you are so different than most?
Um, Most of them don't even try, because you can get inexpensive rosé. You can get pink wine that's really cheap from other places. So a lot of people, they won't even try. This is expensive for us to make, and it's great. And people, they'll go, "Yeah, this is fantastic. This is like the best domestic rosé I've ever had." But it's not Domaine Tempier, or it's not Cibon, or it's like, well, how do you ever get to be that if nobody will ever show it?
Yeah. Yeah.
But we drink a lot of it. It's the wine that Judy and me and my mom um, probably drink the most often of anything, practically every
Mm.
day. Have a little bit of rosé with something to get going, cook dinner, and roll after that.
Yeah. Yep.
So I just adore it. I make it for me, and I sell it because I make more than I can drink.
Good. So we will I'll stop